In the heart of Ohio, there is a town that once looked like every picture-perfect postcard of Midwestern life. Springfield, a place where tree-lined streets framed red brick homes and neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. Yet behind, that calm image was a truth so chilling it scarred the community for decades. Between 1984 and 1986, 3 women of different ages and different walks of life were bound, strangled, and murdered in their own homes. The killer left behind scenes that were unnervingly clean, as if he had erased every trace of himself, leaving police and residents desperate for answers. The press would call him the Springfield Strangler, a name that tore away the innocence of the town and turned safe homes into cages of fear. An innocent man would later be convicted, spending more than 20 years behind bars for crimes he did not commit, while the real killer lived freely among the very people he had terrorized. And when the truth finally emerged decades later, it did not just reveal the face of the Strangler, it exposed the deepest flaws in justice itself. Who was the man who could take 3 lives with such cold precision and vanish without a trace for more than 20 years? And how could a justice system fail so profoundly, punishing an innocent man while the true predator hid in plain sight? If you want to uncover the answers to these questions, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and tell me from which city you are watching this story. Let us complete 5,000 likes on this story to continue bringing hidden truths back to light. Springfield in the 1980s was not unlike many small towns across America. It carried itself with a comforting predictability. People filled church pews on Sundays. Diners echoed with laughter in the mornings, and parents felt secure letting their children roam the neighborhood. Yet, all of this was about to change in November 1984, when the peaceful image of Springfield was torn apart in the most brutal way. Emily Harper was 21 years old, a junior at Wright State University. She was studying psychology, full of ambition, and known by classmates and teachers alike for her kindness and her drive. She lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on Belmont Avenue, in a complex popular with students for its low rent and convenient location. On the evening of November 17th, Emily returned home after her shift at a small local bookstore. Neighbors later remembered the faint sound of her footsteps in the hallway, the hum of a television echoing faintly through the thin walls, and then silence. The next morning she was absent from class. Friends assumed she was unwell, but when an entire day passed with no word from her, concern grew into fear. That evening, a close friend convinced the landlord to open her door. What they found would haunt Springfield forever. Emily lay lifeless on the floor of her bedroom. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with an electrical cord. A brown leather belt was wrapped around her neck, leaving deep marks across her skin. Her clothes were in disarray. Her room, strangely untouched except for the terrible violence done to her. An open textbook rested on the sofa. A half-finished glass of water sat on the table, and the lights glowed faintly, as if time had frozen the moment before her life was taken. There were no fingerprints, no broken windows, no forced entry. It was as though the killer had entered and left without leaving the faintest trace of himself behind. News of Emily's death spread quickly, shaking the foundations of Springfield. She was young, well-liked, and had no enemies. Her funeral was filled with hundreds of grieving classmates, professors, and neighbors. Her mother sat motionless in the front pew, unable to comprehend how her daughter's life had been ended so abruptly. Local headlines screamed about the tragedy, yet what unsettled the community the most was the lack of answers. Lieutenant Robert Manning, the lead investigator, admitted to reporters that it was the cleanest crime scene he had ever encountered. No fingerprints, no footprints, no clear clues, nothing to lead them to the killer. The fact that the apartment showed no signs of forced entry suggested something far more terrifying. Emily might have known her attacker, or at the very least, trusted him enough to let him inside. For Springfield, the nightmare had begun. Emily Harper's death was not just a tragedy. It was a message that safety was an illusion, and the shadow of a predator now stalked their quiet streets. Winter dragged on in Springfield after Emily Harper's brutal death. Snow lined the sidewalks, but the town's spirit felt colder than the icy winds that swept through the streets. For months, people whispered Emily's name, telling their daughters to be careful, locking their doors earlier, and praying the horror would not repeat. But in February of 1985, the nightmare returned, and this time it was even harder to ignore. Dr. Karen Whitfield was 27 years old, a second-year resident at Springfield Regional Hospital. She was admired by her colleagues for her dedication and her ability to smile even during grueling shifts. After finishing a 36-hour stretch at the hospital, Karen returned to her small white house on East High Street, proud of her independence and the life she was building. Neighbors recalled seeing her carry groceries inside and wave politely before closing the door behind her. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. When Karen failed to appear for her next shift, her co-workers grew worried. A senior doctor who cared for her like his own daughter decided to check on her. The house was quiet, the front door locked, but a ground floor window stood open, letting the cold air flow inside. Police entered and discovered a sight that would shake Springfield to its core. Karen was found in her bedroom, her hands bound tightly with torn strips of bedsheets, her neck strangled with a thick telephone cord. There were unmistakable signs she had been assaulted before her death. Her white medical coat still rested neatly on a chair in the living room, as if she had come home exhausted and never made it past her evening routine. The open window fluttered in the breeze, almost like a taunt from the killer, daring anyone to catch him. Investigators combed through the home with painstaking detail, but once again, the crime scene was eerily clean. No fingerprints, no shoe prints, no hairs, nothing that could identify the intruder. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, though one person vaguely remembered a male figure walking down the alley near midnight. The detail was far too vague to help. When news of Karen's death broke, Springfield was hurled back into panic. Two young women, both bound, both strangled, both taken in their own homes, and both leaving behind crime scenes almost unnaturally pristine. The differences in the murder weapons did not lessen the connection. Emily had been strangled with a belt, Karen with a telephone cord. Investigators began to see a terrifying pattern. The killer was using whatever was available in the victims' homes, improvising with calm precision. Reporters pressed Lieutenant Robert Manning for answers. At a tense press conference, his voice was heavy with exhaustion, as he admitted that the possibility of a serial killer could not be ruled out. That single statement spread fear faster than fire. The name Springfield Strangler began to echo in every corner of town. Churches held candlelight vigils for both Emily and Karen, but the prayers offered little comfort. Hardware stores sold out of locks, alarms, and guard dogs. Parents begged their daughters not to live alone. Women avoided being home after dark. The image of Springfield as a safe small town was gone. In its place was a community consumed by fear, convinced that a predator was moving silently among them. And while Springfield tightened its grip on safety, somewhere close by the killer was watching, waiting, and preparing for the next time he would strike. Would you like me to continue with the chilling events that followed when a teenage girl became his next target? Autumn settled over Springfield in 1986 with streets painted in shades of red and gold. But the beauty of the season did little to erase the heavy shadow hanging over the town. Nearly 2 years had passed since the murders of Emily Harper and Dr. Karen Whitfield. Though the community had tried to rebuild, whispers of the Springfield Strangler never fully faded. Parents watched their daughters more closely. Young women avoided staying alone, and every unfamiliar face brought suspicion. Then, on a quiet Sunday in late October, Springfield's fragile sense of safety was shattered once more. Melissa Carter was just 16 years old, a junior at Springfield High School. She was the youngest in her family, a cheerful girl who loved cheerleading and singing in the church choir. Her parents proudly supported her passion for the arts, excited for the partial scholarship she had earned for a summer program. On the night of October 25th, Melissa stayed home to study for a math test while her family attended a birthday party outside town. They called her around 9 o'clock to remind her to get some rest, and she answered happily. It was the last time they ever heard her voice. When her parents returned the next morning, the house was quiet. Nothing seemed out of place until they climbed the stairs to Melissa's room. What they saw would stay with them forever. Melissa lay on her bed, her hands bound tightly with white nylon rope, her neck wrapped with a floral silk scarf. Her desk lamp was still glowing, Her math notebook was open and her pen had fallen to the floor. A normal night of studying had become her last. Police rushed to the scene, but once again they were left with almost nothing. The door had been locked from the outside, the window slightly open, suggesting the killer had slipped in and out like a shadow. There were no fingerprints, no shoe prints, no signs of a struggle, and no clear way to explain how the killer had moved through the home so easily. The crime scene was as flawless as the others, and the killer had once again vanished, without leaving a trace. The news spread through Springfield with terrifying speed. A college student, a doctor, and now a high school girl. All bound, all strangled, all left in scenes that were disturbingly clean. The Springfield Gazette declared that the Springfield Strangler had returned, and this time the whole nation took notice. Television crews from across Ohio arrived in town, turning Springfield into the center of a nightmare story. Fear consumed the community. Parents barred their daughters from being alone. Schools tightened security, and community meetings overflowed with anxious residents who demanded protection. Sales of locks, alarms, and guard dogs surged again, but no one felt safe. Rumors swept through coffee shops and church halls. Some believed the killer was a local man hiding in plain sight. Others feared he was someone trained, perhaps even a policeman or a medic, who knew how to leave no trace behind. The more the press repeated the name Springfield Strangler, the more it took hold of the community's mind. He was no longer an idea, no longer a rumor, but a terrifying presence that seemed to lurk on every street. Residents greeted neighbors with forced smiles, but inside their minds everyone wondered the same thing. Could the man standing beside me be the one who has been killing our daughters? As fear gripped Springfield tighter than ever, the community begged the police for answers. But every lead led nowhere, and the Strangler remained one step ahead, moving unseen, leaving behind nothing but grief and terror. What happened when desperate? Investigators, under the weight of a terrified community, turned their eyes to the wrong man. By the beginning of 1987, Springfield was drowning in fear. 3 women, all young, all bound, all strangled, had been taken from the community in less than 3 years. Parents no longer let their daughters walk alone, students moved back in with family, and residents looked over their shoulders at every sound in the night. The pressure on police was unbearable. The community wanted answers. The press demanded results. People wanted a name, a face, someone to blame. It was in this atmosphere that Daniel Price's life was forever changed. Daniel was 27 years old, a warehouse worker who lived with his mother in a modest home near the train tracks. He was known in town as gentle but slow, a man with limited mental capacity who struggled to keep up in conversations and was often teased. He had no close friends, no influence, and no one to defend him when suspicion turned his way. One evening in March, police brought Daniel in after a witness claimed to have seen him near Emily Harper's apartment the night she was killed. At first, Daniel denied any involvement, confused as to why he was even there. But the questioning did not stop. For hours, officers pressed him, repeating statements, asking him if he was there, suggesting he had done something wrong. Daniel, overwhelmed and frightened, grew confused. His words stumbled, his answers became uncertain, and in his fear he repeated fragments the officer suggested. His unclear responses were shaped into what police called a confession, yet the details never added up. Daniel could not describe Emily's apartment correctly. He did not know what kind of belt was used. He did not remember her friends or her habits. His so-called confession was vague and inconsistent, but it was enough for desperate investigators who needed someone to blame. When the announcement came that a suspect had confessed, Springfield erupted in relief. Headlines declared that the Springfield Strangler had been caught. Daniel's trial was swift. Prosecutors portrayed him as a lonely man who lashed out at a young student. They leaned heavily on his confused confession, while his court-appointed lawyer, inexperienced and without resources, struggled to defend him. There was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints tying him to the murders. But the fear of the community and the pressure for closure was stronger than the doubts. Daniel was sentenced to 35 years in prison for the murder of Emily Harper. For a moment, Springfield seemed to breathe again. Families lit candles, church services filled once more, and the town convinced itself that the nightmare was over. Parents let their children play outside again. Women returned to their apartments, and the sense of constant dread began to ease. But beneath the surface, doubts continued to stir. Emily Harper's parents were never entirely convinced. Melissa Carter's mother whispered to friends that something felt wrong. Even Lieutenant Robert Manning, who had stood before the press and declared justice served, admitted privately to colleagues that he could not shake the feeling that something did not add up. Daniel had no car, no history of violence, and no clear connection to the other victims. But with the town demanding closure, Manning's unease was buried beneath the relief of the public. And so Springfield tried to move on, convinced the Strangler was behind bars, even as whispers lingered in the dark. What happened when years passed? No new murders appeared, but the questions about Daniel Price's guilt refused to stay silent. After Daniel Price was sentenced in 1987, Springfield finally felt the weight lift. For the first time in years, the streets were not filled with constant fear. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years with no new murders. No one was found bound in their home. No sudden screams shattered the night. No breaking headlines announced another tragedy. To many, it seemed proof that the police had been right, that the Springfield Strangler had been caught and caged. Life in the town began to stitch itself back together. Families reopened windows in the summer, children once again played freely in their yards, and the once crowded hardware stores selling locks and alarms quieted down. Springfield began to look and sound like the peaceful Midwestern town it once was. On the surface, the nightmare was over. But for the families of Emily Harper, Karen Whitfield, and Melissa Carter, peace never came. Emily's parents visited her grave often, leaving flowers and standing silently, waiting for answers they knew would never arrive. Melissa's mother kept her daughter's room untouched, as if Melissa might walk in at any moment. Her pink blanket still folded neatly, and her diaries left half-written. Dr. Karen Whitfield's father was seen by neighbors sitting for hours, on his porch staring blankly down the street with a grief that seemed endless. For them, Daniel Price's conviction was no comfort. Their daughters were gone, and the truth behind their deaths remained clouded with doubt. Among the police, Lieutenant Robert Manning could not rest either. Though he had stood before Springfield and declared justice served, deep inside he carried an unease that grew heavier as the years passed. He often pulled out the old case files, reading them late into the night. Each time the same questions haunted him. Daniel's confession never matched the details of the crime scenes. How could a man with no car, no history of violence, and such limited understanding have carried out murders so precise, so clean, and so calculated? Manning felt as though the truth was still hiding in those pages, mocking him, but he had no way to prove it. Meanwhile, the community grew tired of living in fear. They chose silence over suspicion. The murders became a story parents told their children as a dark legend of the past, a warning of the time when Springfield was not safe. By the 1990s, laughter filled the diners again, church bells rang without tension, and the town celebrated its festivals as if the shadow had lifted for good. But behind the smiles, a quiet whisper still followed Springfield. Was Daniel Price truly the man who had done this? Or was the real killer still out there, hidden in plain sight? What would happen when decades later science advanced far enough to reach back into the past and speak for the truth that had been buried? More than 20 years had passed since the murders that haunted Springfield. The town had rebuilt its peace, but for those who had lost loved ones, the pain never truly faded. Families lived with quiet grief, and Lieutenant Robert Manning, now retired, still carried the weight of unanswered questions. Then, in 2008, a door that many thought was forever closed suddenly opened. Ohio had launched a statewide initiative to revisit unsolved cases with modern forensic science. Technology had advanced far beyond what was possible in the 1980s. Evidence that once seemed silent could now reveal secrets with the help of DNA analysis. Among the cases chosen for review were the 3 murders in Springfield. The old files were taken from dusty shelves, and sealed bags of evidence were carefully brought into a modern laboratory. Inside were the belt, the cords, the scarf, and biological samples that investigators in the past had been unable to use. When the first tests came back, the results sent shockwaves through the cold case team. DNA recovered from the cord in Dr. Karen Whitfield's home produced a partial match in the national database, CODIS. It was not a full identification, but it revealed a link to someone already recorded in the system. The killer's DNA belonged to a close relative of that person. The same trace appeared again on the scarf used in Melissa Carter's murder. The conclusion was clear. Daniel Price, who had been imprisoned for more than 20 years, could not have been the killer. The true Springfield Strangler had lived free all this time. The team turned to genetic genealogy, a groundbreaking method that combined DNA with historical records. Specialists worked tirelessly, building family trees that stretched back generations. They searched through birth certificates, death records, and marriage licenses until one branch of the tree led them directly back to Springfield in the 1980s. At the center of it was a man named Mark Benson. Benson had been born in 1957 and worked as an electrician in Springfield during the very years the murders had taken place. His work had taken him close to the homes of all three victims. He had done repairs on Belmont Avenue where Emily Harper lived, worked near the neighborhood where Melissa Carter grew up, and had been seen weeks before Dr. Karen Whitfield's murder in the same area where her home stood. His profession also fit the chilling detail that tied the cases together: the use of cords, ropes, and makeshift bindings that could all be connected to electrical work. What stunned investigators most was that Mark Benson had never once been considered a suspect. He had lived quietly, working steady jobs, blending into the community. In 1988, just 2 years after the last murder, he moved to Dayton, less than an hour away, where he built a new life, started a family, and lived as though nothing had happened. While Springfield believed its nightmare was over, Benson was living freely, raising children, and coaching baseball, all while carrying the darkest of secrets. The cold case team now faced a daunting challenge. The partial DNA match and genealogical links pointed directly to Benson, but that was not enough to convict. They needed a direct, perfect sample of his DNA to confirm beyond doubt that he was the man who had murdered Emily, Karen, and Melissa. Surveillance began. Officers quietly followed Benson, watching for any discarded item that might carry his saliva or skin cells. Day after day, they waited, careful not to alert him. And as investigators closed in, they could not escape the chilling thought that for more than 2 decades, Springfield Strangler had lived as an ordinary man, walking freely among neighbors who never suspected the truth. What would happen when Benson finally slipped, leaving behind the one piece of evidence that could expose him completely? For weeks, investigators trailed Mark Benson in silence, waiting for the moment when he would leave behind something that could carry his DNA. He was cautious, quiet, and lived a routine life, moving between his home and his job sites with little pause. Detectives grew frustrated, knowing that one slip could confirm what years of fear and whispers had hidden. That moment finally came in May of 2008. One morning, Benson stopped at a small coffee shop before heading to a construction site. He ordered a cappuccino, sat quietly in a corner, drank half, and left in a hurry after receiving a call. On the table, he left behind a paper cup stained with saliva. An undercover officer waiting nearby moved swiftly and bagged the cup with careful precision. The evidence was rushed to the lab, and for 3 days the entire cold case team held its breath. When the results arrived, the truth was undeniable. The DNA from the coffee cup was a perfect match to the traces found on the cord from Karen Whitfield's murder, the scarf from Melissa Carter's room, and the samples left in Emily Harper's apartment. After more than 20 years, Springfield's nightmare finally had a name. Mark Benson was the Springfield Strangler. On the morning of June 12, 2008, a SWAT team surrounded Benson's modest, light blue home in suburban Dayton. It was a 2-story house with a neat lawn, a wooden swing on the porch, the image of an ordinary family home. Benson answered the door in shorts and a t-shirt, preparing to take his youngest son to baseball practice. When the arrest warrant was read, his expression froze. For a brief moment, a flicker of cold recognition passed over his face, but then he fell silent. The news exploded across Ohio. Neighbors and friends who had known Benson for years were stunned. He had coached youth baseball, volunteered at community events, and fixed porch lights for neighbors. Mothers cried as they remembered leaving their children in his care, never knowing the kind of darkness that lived behind his calm smile. One woman whispered to reporters that she had trusted him like family, and now she would never trust anyone again. Public outrage spread quickly, not only at Benson, but at the justice system that had allowed him to walk free for so long. Daniel Price, who had spent over 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, became the center of the conversation. Headlines screamed about the wrongful conviction, calling it one of the greatest failures in Ohio's history. Rights groups demanded answers, asking how a man with limited mental capacity could have been locked away while the real killer lived freely among families. Benson's own family struggled to face the truth. His wife refused to believe he was guilty, insisting to reporters that he was a good man who loved his children. His sons faced bullying and isolation, unable to understand how the father who coached their games could be accused of such horrors. Neighbors were torn between shock and betrayal, their memories of barbecues and friendly waves now twisted by the reality that a serial killer had lived among them. Springfield, once again thrust into the spotlight, felt the weight of truth crash down. For years they had lived believing the nightmare was buried, only to learn that the real killer had stood beside them in grocery lines, sat near them in church pews, and smiled as he taught children how to play baseball. What followed was not only the fight to convict Benson, but also a fight to undo decades of injustice for Daniel Price, the man who had lost half his life for crimes he never committed. Only weeks after Mark Benson's arrest, the truth that many had quietly suspected for years could no longer be ignored. Daniel Price, the man who had carried the weight of being labeled the Springfield Strangler, was finally given the chance to prove his innocence. The same DNA evidence that tied Benson directly to the murders showed that Daniel had never been involved. And so, in July of 2008, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Daniel Price's case was brought before the court once more. The courtroom was packed that day, every seat filled with reporters, community members, and families who had lived with this story for so long. When the judge's voice echoed through the room declaring Daniel Price officially innocent, the atmosphere shifted into something unforgettable. For a moment, Daniel simply stood frozen, as though he could not believe the words. His face, gaunt and aged beyond his years, trembled before he collapsed onto the table, sobbing uncontrollably. From the back of the courtroom, a frail elderly woman struggled to her feet. It was Eleanor, Daniel's mother, who had never once stopped fighting for her son's freedom. Slowly, with her cane in hand, she made her way forward. When Daniel's handcuffs were removed, he rushed into her arms. The two clung to each other, weeping in a way that carried both pain and relief. For the crowd, it was impossible not to cry with them. That image, Daniel weeping in his mother's arms after 23 years of lost freedom, appeared on front pages across Ohio with headlines declaring justice at last. Yet behind the emotional reunion was a painful truth. Daniel had entered prison in his 20s, a young man with hopes of building a life. He left as a middle-aged man with gray streaks in his hair, carrying the scars of years spent in isolation. His youth, his freedom, and his chance to live an ordinary life had been stolen. In his first interview, Daniel spoke softly, saying he had prayed every day for the truth to be found but never imagined it would take so long. He admitted he had lost nearly everything, but he still clung to the hope of living quietly with his mother in the time he had left. The public's reaction was a storm of outrage. How could a man with limited mental capacity have been interrogated into confusion, forced into a false confession, and then abandoned by a justice system meant to protect him? Human rights groups demanded reforms. Lawyers, professors, and activists called for changes in interrogation practices, insisting that all questioning be recorded in full and that vulnerable individuals receive stronger protections. Newspapers called Daniel's story a scar on the conscience of Ohio. For Springfield, the emotions were mixed. Some felt deep remorse, admitting that they had turned their backs on Daniel when he needed support most. Others struggled to accept that such a grave mistake had been allowed to happen. But no matter, the perspective, one truth was clear. The justice system had failed, and Daniel Price had paid the price with 23 years of his life. What followed was not only the trial of Mark Benson, but a reckoning for Springfield itself, as the town finally faced the man who had haunted it for decades. By November of 2009, the entire state of Ohio turned its eyes toward Clark County as the long-awaited trial of Mark Benson began. This was not only the trial of a man, but the closing chapter of a nightmare that had haunted Springfield for over 2 decades. From early morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with families of the victims, reporters with cameras, and residents who had lived in fear for years. Security was doubled, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Inside the courtroom, the silence was heavy as the prosecutor stood to speak. His words struck like thunder. Mark Benson was charged with the first-degree murders of Emily, Harper, Karen Whitfield, and Melissa Carter. He told the jury that the DNA evidence did not lie. Samples from the cord, from the scarf, and from the scenes of the crimes all matched Benson with complete certainty. He reminded them that the same careful silence at every crime scene, the same method of binding, and the same calculated cruelty tied all 3 murders together. This was not coincidence. This was a pattern of a serial killer who had walked free for far too long. The evidence came piece by piece, each detail hammering the truth deeper into the room. Forensic experts described how the evidence had been preserved and retested with modern methods that left no room for doubt. Witnesses recalled small but haunting memories, like neighbors who saw Benson near Emily Harper's apartment late at night, or a coworker who remembered his strange obsession with ropes and cords, always carrying them in his truck. When crime scene photos were shown, the room seemed to stop breathing. The images of Emily's bound hands, Karen's lifeless body, and Melissa's bed where her final moments had ended brought quiet sobs from the families. Emily Harper's parents held hands tightly, trembling. Melissa's mother pressed her daughter's school photo against her chest, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Karen Whitfield's brother stared coldly at Benson, his jaw set in rage. Benson sat motionless throughout the trial, his face pale, his eyes distant. He spoke little, offering no explanation, no apology, no denial. His lawyer argued weakly that DNA could be contaminated, that memories could fade, but the sheer weight of the evidence crushed every attempt to cast doubt. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with the verdict. Mark Benson was found guilty on all counts of murder. When the judge pronounced the sentence, death by lethal injection, the courtroom erupted with emotion. Families wept openly, some clinging to each other in relief, others staring silently, as the weight of decades seemed to finally crash down. Yet even in that moment of justice, there was no celebration. The families knew nothing could bring back Emily, Karen, or Melissa. Springfield itself carried the scars of years of fear and the painful truth that an innocent man had suffered while the real killer lived freely among them. The verdict brought relief, but also a sobering lesson. Justice delayed comes at a terrible cost. What happened afterward showed that this case was not only about crime and punishment, but also about how a community heals and demands change. After the trial ended and Mark Benson was sentenced, Springfield was left to face the weight of decades of grief. The families of Emily Harper, Dr. Karen Whitfield, and Melissa Carter began speaking publicly for the first time. Their words were not just filled with sorrow, but also with strength. Emily's parents admitted that every morning since 1984 they had woken up hearing their daughter's scream in their minds. Melissa's mother held her daughter's photo and reminded the world that she was only 16, her entire future stolen. Karen's brother spoke of her dream to open a clinic for the poor, a dream silenced too soon. Through their pain, they found a purpose. They turned their grief into advocacy, demanding that no other family be forced to wait decades for justice. The community itself came together. In Springfield's Central Park, a memorial was built with 3 names engraved in stone, Emily Harper, Dr. Karen Whitfield, and Melissa Carter. Beneath their names were simple words that carried a powerful truth. No one is forgotten. No truth stays buried forever. Residents often visited, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten letters. Scholarships were also created in each of the girls' names, giving young students the chance to pursue their dreams, the very dreams that had been taken from them. Beyond Springfield, the case became a turning point in the history of justice. Forensic genealogy, which had unmasked Benson after more than 20 years, was hailed as a new weapon against forgotten crimes. Police departments across the nation began reinvesting in cold case units, ensuring evidence would never again gather dust in silence. Laws were passed to make sure all interrogations were fully recorded, protecting vulnerable suspects like Daniel Price from being coerced into false confessions. What began as a tragedy in a small Midwestern town sparked reforms that echoed across America. Yet the legacy of the Springfield Strangler was not only about science or reform, it was about what justice means when it arrives late. Springfield learned that the truth can be delayed, but it cannot be erased. The community carried scars, but it also carried the strength to demand change, to honor those who were lost, and to ensure that their memory lived on in action. This case will forever be remembered as both a tragedy and a turning point, a story of pain, injustice, and finally truth. And here at Unscripted Tales, it stands as proof that even the darkest shadows can one day be revealed. If you are still watching this story, it means this journey deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help me reach the target of 5,000 likes because it is a promise I set for my mother, and your support costs nothing but means everything. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this story?